I am Gaurav. I've been working with small keys for about 2.5 years now, and today I'm going to talk about conditional props in React component and how TypeScript helps with the developer experience around it. Quick things about me: I live with my family in Bangalore. I've been working at small case. You can find my social handles on the right hand side to ask me any questions after the talk. Quickly moving to the agenda, this is what we would try to cover in today's talk. I'll try to define the problem in the most relatable way possible because I want this talk to be beginner friendly. So I'll try to define the problem with some real examples from small case code base. Then I'll just discuss the solution skeleton, and then hopefully we'll see the solution working in code sandbox. Then we'll also look at some of the problems that still exist with the current solution, and then I'll try to define names for the things that we are using as part of the solution, because like I don't want to discuss those names within during the talk. That might be slightly advanced for people. Then the expected outcomes out of the session, I am definitely not expecting you to understand this pattern just by going through this talk. I'm expecting you to know that these kind of things are possible with TypeScript, and I'll give you some pointers about what these patterns are called so that you can do your further research. uh, Quickly trying to define the problem. This is one of the examples that I'll use. So if you can see, this is a CTA component as we call it internally, and this can be rendered as a button, this can be rendered as a link, or this can be rendered as a general div without any operation. In the first example, you can see for login, it actually just opens up a modal on the same page. For discover small cases, it opens up a new link within the same small case website. And in the third example, which generally we use on mobile, where the tap area is really less and we want people to make sure that tapping anywhere near the CTA actually does the trick for them, we make sure the container is clickable but the CTA itself is non-interactive. Going to another quick example, we have this placard component which can have multiple variants. One of the variants is a no op variant where we just show some static text which is not interactive. Another variant is this internal link variant where we have this create small case button which takes you internally to the create small case page, and it uses a React router link to render this internal link component. Then there is the CTA placard which uses a button which on click opens up a model on the same page. And then there is this download app CTA which takes you outside of the small case ecosystem, in which case we use the anchor tag for this component, right? So just coming back to what the problem is, you would have components which have multiple variants which would take multiple props, but not all the combinations of those props would be valid. So how do you make sure that your developers, while using the component or at runtime, do not end up passing invalid props or invalid prop combinations, and rather they get to know this information much earlier, right? So in our example, when you want to use the link CTA, you would want to make sure that the consumer passes the href prop. But when you're using the button CTA or the no op CTA, you want to make sure that the href prop is not possible to pass at all. Like there should be some check that the href prop is not going to be applicable with button or no op. A few things that are outside of the scope of current discussion, because I know some of you might have these questions. One is, you might think that this component is trying to do too much and it is better to actually make individual components for button CTA, link CTA, and no op CTA. Again, we can discuss this separately. Button versus link debate for things like why do your links look like button. I think this is again outside of the scope of this talk. We can definitely discuss it separately with respect to accessibility and semantics. Now, coming to the solution skeleton, what do we want as a solution, right? So as I said, we would want to make sure that the developers do not mistakenly end up passing invalid combination of props. So somehow we need to stop it at the development level itself, right? And what would help with it, if your IDE can provide some kind of intelligence and auto completion around which props are valid, what is the valid value of those props, and which props are not valid, and if you try to pass in that prop, the IDE would show you a warning on an error. That would definitely be great. But the major thing that we anyway need to ensure is, even if invalid combination of props is passed, the component does not break at runtime, right? So this is something that we need to definitely ensure. The third part, which is not breaking at runtime, this is something that you can make sure by following certain patterns in your code base using regular JavaScript as well. But the first two things, TypeScript can definitely help us with that. So we'll quickly see how TypeScript can help us with that. Going to the solution, first thing first, we'll try to create the markup and the styles. So these are some screenshots for the markup for anchor, markup for button, markup for div. Notice that we are actually using the semantic components for link and button and div, and not using a div for everything. Then you might also notice something called rest or spread props here. which is something that we'll ignore for now, but we'll discuss that either in the example or after the talk. The second thing is we need to have some way to define when to render each of these individual markups. So in this case, I am just taking a kind prop, where if the consumer passes kind equal to button, we just render the button. If the consumer passes kind equal to link, we just render the link. And if the consumer does not pass a kind or passes it undefined, we just render the div. Now this is completely in JavaScript till now, and we have this problem that if someone passes kind equal to button but also passes href alongside it, there is no way for us to tell them that this is invalid. Like we can definitely it is not easy to do that using prop types. It is not easy to do that at compile time or build time using JavaScript. Definitely we can do that at runtime, but then that is probably too late. So the next thing that we would want to do is to start adding types to it, right? So one quick way of adding types to this, which would be incorrect, which wouldn't solve our problem, is you will create a single interface called CTA props, where you will add all the props that are possible, and you'll just make sure that any props which are not applicable for all of these different variants are marked as optional. For example, the href prop, since it is not applicable for button, it is only applicable for link, you pass it as optional. But this does not solve the problem, because when someone is trying to use the component, even if they pass kind equal to button, and if they start typing href, the id is still going to show them the intelligence that href is something which is possible. It will not tell them that if you are using kind equal to button, you shouldn't pass href, right? So how do we solve that? We solve that using something like this. Like just go through this pattern. We'll discuss this in slight more details, but like some of the things you can ignore for now for the context of this talk. So we define a common interface for all the common props that all of these different variants should have. So in this case, text is the only common prop. Then we define a button CTA prop, we define a link CTA props, we define a non-semantic CTA props, each of which have a hard coded kind mentioned there, right? This information is important. The kind thing has to be part of each of this definition, because that is what helps TypeScript with narrowing down what you are trying to pass. And then you can see that the href prop is only defined for link CTA props and not for anything else. You may also notice that there is something called react.component props without ref, which we are using to make sure that this component allows any props which can be used by HTML button, which is like in accordance with the REST pattern that we saw earlier. But yeah, that is not really important for understanding what we are trying to achieve here. We are trying to achieve that href prop should not be allowed to be passed from button CTA or from non-semantic CTA, and href prop should be uh, mandatory when you are passing the link CTA, when you are using the link CTA, right? And this is how our component looks like now. It is mostly similar. We still use the props.kind equal to button, props.kind equal to link, but the only thing that we have changed is that now we are restructuring the props much later instead of destructuring them earlier. This is required because that is how TypeScript narrowing works. So this is like just one thing that you'll notice has changed, but nothing else has changed as such. We have just defined the props to be of CTA props type. I'll quickly try to give you a walkthrough so that like you can actually see how these things are working, or how these would lead to problems. Yeah, hopefully you can see my code sandbox screen. So here I have defined all three of them. There is a button, there is a link, there is a CTA which is no op, right? So where I've defined kind equal to button, if I try to pass in href, you'll see that there is no auto completion for href. And if I try to pass in, it will actually mention that href does not exist on this type. But at the same time, if I try to pass in href to the link, it actually gives me auto completion that this attribute exists on link cta props.href. There is another attribute which link accepts, which is at hreflang. And in case I do not pass href, you see that it is actually giving me an error that href is required to be passed, right? So I'll just pass some href for now. Similarly, on the no op CTA also, if I try to pass href, it will not give me a auto completion. Like the auto completion that you see here is just string auto completion, because I've used href multiple times as a string, but it is not giving me any prop auto completion, right? So this actually solves the purpose that we were initially heading out to solve. Uh, a few other things, because of this setup that we have where we extend from a particular component, you'll see that since we are using kind equal to link, it should only accept props which a link component should have. So if I try to pass it a disabled prop, it will not give me auto completion. But if I try to pass the disabled prop to the button, it will actually give me auto completion, because disabled prop exists on the button types in HTML, right? So this is something extra that we were able to achieve using this setup. So quickly going back to the slides, I'll quickly discuss why this works. So there is something called type narrowing in TypeScript, based on which it can determine, once it has narrowed down the types, that what would be the rest of the types be, right? So we are achieving type narrowing in this case using something called discriminated unions. I'll come back to that quickly. But yeah, this is what the solution achieves. Uh, Quickly going through some of the issues that you would see with the current solution, which can definitely be improved. One is we need to destruct the props much later instead of much earlier, as some of you might have a habit of destructuring the props earlier. And another thing is, you cannot ignore or cannot omit the kind prop on the div. You have to actually pass it as kind equal to null, so that TypeScript can correctly identify it and narrow it down, right? Uh, so this kind of concludes the solution. I'll just conclude my talk with some of the related concepts which you can explore around this, and what are these patterns called, so that you can have some further research around it. The first thing that this uses is type narrowing using discriminated unions. There is a good documentation about both of these things in TypeScript official docs. You can go through that. Another thing that we have discussed is conditional props, in which your React component might accept multiple combination of props, some of which might be conditional in case you want to pass some combinations together, and some combinations should never be possible. Those are called conditional props. We have also slightly touched upon a concept for polymorphic components. So you saw that these examples, they render as different HTML elements based on the kind prop, so button or link or div. So these are one variant for polymorphic components, where you render a different markup based on certain prop, and the component is polymorphic. It can render as any type of component or any two or three type of components. Then the other pattern we saw was rest or spread props pattern, which we use to make sure that the consumer can actually pass all of the props which should be accessible to a button by default, and we do not need to explicitly expose them to the consumer. For example, disabled is something that we did not expose to the consumer, but since we were using this rest props method pattern, we were able to make sure that the consumer can still pass the disabled prop to the button. Then for polymorphic components, I think again, this is not the only pattern that you can use. You can solve the same problems using generics or generic components as well, which is slightly advanced, but yeah, that is definitely an option apart from discriminated union. Then another concept that you may see in the while is omitting the keys that you are already defining but extending. So in this case, if you saw, we are already defining type equal to button, which means that when we are extending from the button type, we should actually not extend the but type key, because we do not want the consumer to be able to pass the type key, because we have already hard-coded it, in which case you would omit it. I have added this to my code sandbox. You can check it out there. Another thing that generally happens with conditional props is that you use never for keys that you do not want to allow in a prop combination. Never is again a concept which exists in TypeScript, which makes sure that if you try to pass in a value, you are not allowed to, which will you will definitely face while you are working with conditional props. And then, yeah, I think already discussed intersection types or generics for extending component instead of or alongside the discriminated union, right? So these are some of the concepts that you can explore to understand more about these patterns. Uh, this concludes my talk. Hopefully, you got this awareness that these kind of things are possible with TypeScript and how they can help with your development or developer experience. Thank you, everyone. Please reach out to me on Twitter or elsewhere for any further questions that you have.